Hello everyone and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Halleck. This week, the growing frustration among community and political leaders in both the U.S. and Canada pushing to get plans in place to reopen the northern border.
Charles de participer à ce panel sur la question de la frontière entre...
Former Quebec Premier Jean Charest joined a webinar hosted by a coalition of Chamber of Commerce groups from across the province. He and North Country Chamber President Garry talked about the collective sense of urgency in getting both the U.S. and Canadian governments to set guidelines and a timetable to reopen the border, which has remained closed to all but essential traffic for more than a year.
Make no mistake, a wall has been placed between us on the border. In the U.S., we've heard much over the last 4 years about a physical wall at the Mexican border, but a wall that is even sturdier and more exclusive in terms of its impact has actually now been placed between the U.S. and Canada, and who would have thought that would ever happen? And one of the things that I think we all hope, is to heighten the sense of urgency around this. That it isn't just, oh, someone can't get across the border so they can shop at a store. You know, it has those kinds of impacts. Those are certainly very real to many of our businesses, but it is fundamentally harming the U.S.-Canadian special relationship. And the fact that it has gone on so long has already created lasting damage that we'll have to work long and hard to repair as we go forward. The whole wall isn't going to come down tomorrow, but maybe we might open a few gateways in the wall as a starting point to allow some people to do some things and to start at least a way forward. We need to find a positive sense that everybody, both governments, are engaged in finding the way forward, not just stating what the obstacles and complications are.
400,000 people crossed the northern border daily before the pandemic. And former Premier Charest, who is on an advisory panel put together by the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, says it will likely be several more months into the fall before the two countries feel comfortable enough to reopen the border.
Both governments are very determined to, first of all, fight COVID. And that's the first priority in our respective jurisdictions. And that's quite legitimate, of course. And to do whatever we must do to be able to fight it effectively and bring the curve down and save as many lives as we need to save. What no one could predict, though, is the effect of the variants and the situation we're in today. And the question is, how long will this go on and what's next? The key is vaccination. As long as, if we're not going to see, I think, a reopening of the border until we get a level of vaccination on both sides of the border that is fairly high enough.
If infection and hospital rates drop and enough people get vaccinated, Charest believes Canada would move ahead with lifting the restrictions on crossing the border with certain conditions.
I'm anticipating that what we can contemplate at the border in the future is that if you cross over, you will have to demonstrate, A, that you've been vaccinated, B, that you've been recently tested, and that you may be tested afterwards. And that there may be, in certain circumstances, depending on the provinces, because they're the ones who also have a say in this, they may very well determine that there would be a quarantine period.
With polls consistently showing a majority of Canadians worried about reopening the border, Charest says it will be up to political leaders to get plans moving, which he suspects may be slowed with the federal election likely being called and on the horizon in the early fall.
The political leaders are the ones who have to step up here and make the case that there is, yes, a risk, but it can be controlled, it can be managed, and it represents a certain percentage of possible or potential contamination, but it can be managed. We can put in place systems that will allow us to verify vaccination, verify testing, and allow people to do the right thing. But for that to happen, political leaders have to lead on this as opposed to following public opinion. Now, just as an aside, one of the realities of Canada is that we're looking at an election campaign in the fall, probably. It's a minority government, and I don't have any secrets. No one's shared any inside information with me on this, but there's a high probability of a Canadian election, federal election in the fall. And that will make it more difficult for Mr. Trudeau to reopen the border, because until that campaign happens, he'll may not want to run the risk of creating an issue in the election campaign.
And from Washington, the legislative director for Congresswoman Elise Stefanik said the Northern Border Caucus is trying to get more members of Congress to call on the Biden administration to coordinate efforts with Canada and get reopening plans in place.
We need to pressure our national governments to dedicate themselves to giving a plan. I'm going to be very honest with you. I think in what the discussions we've had, we did not get a sense that there was a sense, we did not feel that there was a sense of urgency, either on the American or on the Canadian side, to address this issue. We did not get that sense, that feeling that they felt that this was something they got to deal with right now and think about. Well, I think if our challenge in the short term is to move them to that level where they're actually committing to delivering a plan. They don't have to reopen the border, but at least commit to delivering some plan within a certain time frame that says, here is a commitment we'll make. By this date, we'll commit to a plan, and start describing to us what it looks like when we reopen the border. How would it work so that we can prepare?
And while a bad connection kept Congresswoman Stefanik from joining the discussion, she sent along a video with what she hopes both governments will do to get plans in place to lift the current restrictions at the border.
Cross-border travel is critical to the overall economic well-being of my district and a way of life for those with families or properties on both sides of the border. And this continued uncertainty that comes from the monthly extensions without substantive signs of progress has caused significant hardships for my constituents. As co-chair of the bipartisan Northern Border Caucus, I have urged the Biden administration to make bilateral collaboration an immediate priority and solidify a truly metrics-based bilateral plan to safely reopen the U.S.-Canadian border, providing our communities and businesses an understanding of what they can expect in the coming months, and the assurance that both sides are working to restore travel as soon as possible.